Hey y'all, I'm Mary Carroll Dodd,
And I'm Mark Dempsey.
and welcome to Build Your Soil and Farm Resilience Small Scale No-Till Methods. We're so glad that you're here with us, and we look forward to hanging out with you today.
So, for some quick introductions of who we are, my name again is Mark Dempsey. I work at CFSA. I've been at CFSA for about 6 years. And for about the last 10 years or so, I've worked in organic no-till research and production. The first sort of like 5 years of that, I was working on a large scale grain farming. And then the second 5 years was working kind of smaller scale veggie production systems. And meanwhile, also kind of just like playing around with different things and sort of a garden homestead type situation. Um, at CFSA and in general, I kind of get pretty excited about teaching folks about soil management and soil health, about trying to do a good job and learn how to do a good job, about using cover crops, trying to make no-till doable for all, which is going to be some of the focus of the presentation later on toward the end when we talk about some of the research that we've done at CFSA and at Red Scout Farm. And just to throw it out there, I happen to think that the magic sauce in no-till, at least for small scale growers, with the kind of like constraints we might have here in the mountains, is cover crops and landscape fabric. I think it's just like a pretty magic combination that will get you there to successful production. So we'll hear plenty more about that soon, though.
And hey, I'm Mary Carroll Dodd, and I'm with Red Scout Farm in Black Mountain, North Carolina. My background is in science education. I was an environmental science and biology teacher and also a director of global education for 10 years before I started farming, and I'm now in my 5th year of farming. I always had large school gardens with my students and really enjoyed gardening and was excited to be able to take that step to move into farming. We are certified organic, do mixed vegetables on about 3/4 of an acre. We go to one market, we have a 40-member CSA, and also sell to several restaurants. We use low-till and no-till practices, and we have one 16 by 100 caterpillar tunnel, and we're getting ready to add another one. And we also have a small heated greenhouse where we start all of our seedlings on the farm. So first of all, we just wanted to go into why no-till and also talk a little bit about soil, give you a few little science lessons before we get into our study. So first of all, why no-till? So one reason is because it keeps the soil structure intact. You're not constantly churning up and tilling up that soil and destroying the structure of it. Tilling, especially if you have heavy clay soils, can create a hard pan layer. And so what that means is it creates this hard clay area by the tiller constantly coming through and pressing that soil down. And it makes it really hard for roots to penetrate that hard pan layer and to access nutrients that might be deeper in the soil. Also with no-till, it helps to hold more water in the soil. And we have an increased infiltration of water into the soil through all of those channels that the roots create. And especially once those roots die and decompose, it leaves some space in the soil for water to infiltrate. And in turn, this helps improve our soil ecosystem. So also we have decreased runoff. If you have a really heavy rain event, if your soil is uncovered and bare, then a lot of that great topsoil can wash away. But in no-till, the roots of the soil are going to hold that, the roots of the plants are going to hold that soil in place. And also the cover crops can create this nice mulch on top of the soil to also help hold it into place. Also, you have decreased pollution. The amendments and fertilizers that you add are going to stay put because the mulch and the roots of those plants can help hold it in place. And also there's less heavy machinery required generally in no-till, which means you're going to have decreased air pollution and a lower use of fossil fuels. And for the most part, you have less weeds in no-till because you're not constantly tilling up the soil and bringing up new weed seeds. You're leaving that soil undisturbed. So there are less weeds, except for in some cases.
Yeah, I would say it's really nice to be able to leave your soil undisturbed in order to not bring up new weed seeds. Although the ones that do make it through and do germinate can end up being problematic if you just don't have the time, or you're working at a scale that's big enough to where you can't follow through and deal with them. And if you get like, a few hundred weeds that set seed in like a given area in one year, then you're going to have like a heck of a lot more than that the next year. And so um, it's difficult to get in there with a hoe if you're working at a scale that where you're going to be using a hoe for weed control, just because you've got this cover crop mulch most of the time that sort of prevents the being able to get a tool in there. And so that usually means you're just going to be stuck with hand weeding. Now there is some like mechanized versions of weeding if you're working with a tractor, or like maybe something that could fit onto a walk behind tractor that's specialized and it's for specifically or this organic no-till situation. But generally this is going to be hand weeding. And so just be aware of it. It can either just be prepared, have a good plan set up for if you are going to be scaling up, be prepared to adjust those weeds with the amount of labor for what does come through. It really depends on your fields. If you happen to be lucky enough to work in a field with not a lot of weed pressure and seeds that are going to be germinating without disturbance, then you're golden. But if you happen to be working in a field that hasn't seen a lot of no-till in years, just keep an eye out for weeds. And as maybe a final note, perennials love no-till. And so whether that's dock or mugwort or something else, if given a chance, they'll get a good foothold, and just be diligent about those as well.
So yeah, getting in there early, getting them when they're young, especially before they set seed and rain that seed down onto your fields. The more that you can get in there, just get in there with your bucket early and weed. And next year it'll probably be even easier. So another reason is there are a lot of positive benefits for climate change here. So I'll go through this more in the next slide, but plants remove carbon dioxide from the soil. So in our air, a small portion of that is carbon dioxide. Plants use that through photosynthesis, and they release some of that through respiration. But when the plant dies, soil microbes will break up that carbon, and if the soil is left undisturbed, then that carbon will stay in the soil. If you till, then sometimes that carbon can then be released back into the atmosphere. So more carbon is retained in the soil through no-till methods. And this explains that a little bit more. So this is how soil microbes capture carbon. So one is through photosynthesis. Plants take in that carbon dioxide from the air and they give off oxygen. And then that carbon dioxide, it is converted into these sugary compounds in the soil. And then they take those sugary compounds all the way down into the roots. And then those are called exudates. And so those go out into the soil and feed the soil microorganisms. And another way that the soil microbes capture carbon is at the end of the plant's life cycle. So all of those roots that are below ground, once the plant dies, those roots are going to begin to decay, and the microorganisms break them down into carbon-rich organic matter. And also as they do that, they release nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, some other micronutrients, and all of those are released in a form that plants can use. So those nutrients are there to help feed the microbes, and also for the next plants that you put in the ground. So let's talk a little bit about soil, healthy soil versus dead soil. So with soil, you've got 3 particle sizes. You've got sand, silt, and clay. And that makes up the majority of soil. And what those are just broken down pieces of rocks and minerals that happen through weathering and erosion. And sand is the biggest particle size, then silt, and then clay. And so with healthy soil, you want sand, silt, and clay mixed together. When they're all mixed together like that, it's called loam. And you also want some organic matter mixed in there. You want them mixed together and connected loosely so that there are pockets of air and that there are pockets for water to go through. You also, when you have that, you're likely to have a lot of different microbes. So you have algae, you have fungi, you have protozoa, you have bacteria. And then also you want plant diversity. So you want those roots of the soil, the roots from the plants coming down into the soil, And the greater diversity of plants you have above ground, the greater diversity of roots you're going to have below ground. And so you want lots of roots and hopefully different kinds of roots, which means that you are planting different kinds of plants in the same bed. So dead soil, you've got these particles of sand and silt and clay, and they may be more separated. They'd be pretty compacted. You don't have a lot of plants or roots to feed the microbes. And so then you have less and less diverse microbial life and less soil organic matter. So building soil, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. You really have to play the long game here. This is just shows a graph from a study through NRCS, and this is talking about soil aggregate stability. So as I was talking about before, you have your sand, your silts, and your clay and your organic matter. And the way that all of those are held together and connected, that is called soil aggregate stability. And so the greater percentage you have of soil aggregate stability, the healthier your soil is probably going to be. And so ideally you want those particles loosely connected, and with long-term no-till, the results are showing that soil aggregate stability increases the longer that you have no-till practices on your farm. And that also just helps increase all that biological activity. All of those microbes can be happier when they have a wonderful place to live. So compost, this is something that is often used in no-till systems. It's an easy way to add a lot of organic matter quickly to your soils. However, we wanted to share in this presentation that there are other methods to build your soils, and also it's also good to be wary of compost sometimes. So the pros for compost, they provide nutrients for the plants, they conserve water and increase microbial activity. That nitrogen is released slowly, which feeds the plants over time. I'll share a little bit about that.
Yeah, and one thing to note about that, so maybe it's advantageous to have sort of a slow release of nitrogen over time, so that you can avoid burning your plants, compared to some of the more high octane nitrogen fertilizers that you can get for organics, like maybe blood meal or feather meal. But just be aware that you shouldn't think of compost as a nitrogen source. And so for a quick kind of I guess a little bit on data for that, there's a graph in the bottom left that's the plant available nitrogen based on days after application, and you can see different colored lines that relate to blood meal or feather meal, fish meal, poultry manure, and compost. And you can see that compost is like the one that's at the very bottom, and it never gets very high. The release is very slow, years or more, and there's just not a lot in there compared to the fertilizers. So just throwing out that as a little word of caution. If you're applying a lot of compost, just be prepared to find your nitrogen somewhere else.
So also, compost can be expensive. If you're trying to make it yourself, you're going to need a lot of material in order to make it, and it can be time consuming to make. And most importantly, if you don't have a trusted source of compost, it could contain persistent herbicides. And this has been a problem in recent years. Small amounts of herbicides can create large amounts of damage on your crops. And so especially if it's compost that's made from hay or sod or other grasses, or even if it's made from animal manure, from animals that ate that grass, then these can be this can be persistent in your soil. So just be wary of that, and make sure you know where your compost is coming from. This picture here at the top just shows some curling leaves of an eggplant, and that can be a sign of herbicides in your compost. Another thing to look out for is the pH. So if you are purchasing compost, you can ask about the pH, especially in compost that has a lot of food waste. The pH can even be up to 8. So that can make your soils more alkaline. So just be careful of that. If you have really high acidic soils, that can be a positive. But if your soils are already pretty neutral, then just be careful. So we wanted to get into some strategies for building soil through no-till. I'm going to give you just a few quick ideas right now and then go into some of those more in depth. So one is just leaving the roots of all of your crops So just cutting at the base when you are removing the cash crop for harvest or to clean the bed. Prioritize really getting those cover crops in, trying to get in at least one cover crop per bed in a year. Smothering the crops with silage tarps instead of tilling in crop residue can be helpful. Incorporating livestock, compost teas, also companion planting and looking into different combinations. One great one can be kale and parsley. And so if you plant parsley at the base of the kale plants, that can increase the mycorrhizal activity in your soil. And also things like planting radishes at the base of beans or planting lettuce at the base of tomatoes. And that just helps keep the soil covered. It increases the diversity of roots that are below ground and will also help to build your soil. So one thing you can do is planting into cover crop mulch. An example would be rye and landscape fabric, and we'll get into this more later as it relates to the study we've been doing for the past couple of years. And so in the fall, I plant winter rye into weed-free beds. I try to tarp the beds for a week or two before I plant into them to try to let those weed seeds germinate. And I try to get it in between mid-September and mid-October. And then it begins to grow in the late fall, and during the winter, we don't see a lot of growth, but then in the spring, it'll start to grow. And by late May, in our climate, it is ready to mow or crimp. So once we mow or crimp it, we cover with landscape fabric, and then we plant right into that mulch that is made by the rye. So then we harvest that winter squash in August. So we've done butternut squash here in this particular case. And then after I remove that landscape fabric, I've got this beautiful bed of this partially decomposed rye mulch, and it's ready to plant something else. So I can add amendments. This year I planted beets in one bed, I planted garlic in one bed, and I planted some cover crops in other beds, but it made it ready for that next succession of crops. And then you can tarp that for the winter, and it'll be ready for some early spring crops, or you could get in a cover crop. Another idea is shifting landscape fabric. We use a lot of landscape fabric on our farm where we pre-burn holes, and that really helps to cut down on any weeds and also helps to conserve water so that we have to water less. And so we prep and amend the beds in the spring and then lay down our irrigation in that landscape fabric. And then in this example, I planted kale, and then midsummer for us, once the harlequin bugs really start to come in, and we go ahead and cut that kale out and then take out the landscape staples, move that landscape fabric down just 6 inches. And then I have a clean space to plant the next crop. And so I then follow that by a summer lettuce. And you do have to add a little bit of amendment in each of the holes where you're gonna plant the lettuce, because a lot of the amendments that you put down for the kale have been used, but you can just put that right directly in the hole and then use the lettuce. And then the roots from the kale begin to decay and turn into organic matter and turn into nutrients that your lettuce plants can use, or even the crop that follows that can use. So that's a great way to help build the soil. Just make sure you're rotating your crops there. So if you're doing a brassica like kale, try not to follow that with, say, bok choy or broccoli, but try to go to a different family, maybe do a chard or a lettuce or something like that. So also planting into cover crop mulch, but using a tarp instead of landscape fabric. So we did this this year with corn. We plant a small amount of corn for our CSA members in 3 different successions. And so we mowed our rye and then planted the corn transplants directly into that mulch. So the first succession, we didn't tarp at all. You can see that in the bottom of your screen where it says no tarp. That got pretty weedy because those weeds were able to come up right through that flail mowed rye mulch. The next succession, we tarped for about a week and a half, and that did pretty well. And then the last succession, we had tarped for 3 weeks. And so you can see that in the bottom of the screen as well. Tarping was really helpful for making those weed seeds that were at the top germinate and die. And so there was very little weeding that we had to do for that plot. So 2 to 3 weeks would be ideal if you're not going to use landscape fabric to tarp after a cover crop. So another thing is you can do is intercropping. So here in this example, this is from another farmer, and he planted clover underneath the collards. And so clover fixes nitrogen, and so you've got nitrogen being put into the soil in a plant's in a form that the plants can use, and the collards are able to access that nitrogen. So coming back to silage tarps, this is a great way to kill and suppress weeds and also to help your cover crops and cash crops decompose to get them ready for the next planting. Cover or silage tarps come in all different sizes. They can be hard to move around with one person if they get really big. But we cut our silage tarps into different size pieces. Some I cut to just go on one row because sometimes I just need to smother a cover crop on one row to get it ready. And then we have some that are 100 by 24 that can cover multiple beds at once. So they are nice to have, and they're not too difficult to cut up into the sizes that you need. And then also keeping weeds out of the aisles. So one thing you can do is use wood chips. That's really popular in no-till systems if you have access to hopefully free or inexpensive wood chips. If you can be picky, you can ask for ramial wood chips. Those are the wood chips that come from the branches rather than from the trunk of the tree. And eventually those wood chips are going to break down after several years and they can be added to the beds. You don't want to have the wood chips near on your vegetable beds because they can help or they can steal the nitrogen and make it harder for your cash crops to grow. But that is one reason why they're great in the aisles is because they can help prevent weeds from growing. Also, another thing, if you'll look at the picture in the bottom right here, is putting white clover in the aisles. So we did this between our pepper plants this year. And it works really well if you have landscape fabric or plastic on your pepper plants or your eggplant or tomatoes. And then you can plant that New Zealand white clover, which is a more drought resistant variety. You can plant that right in the aisles. You can walk on top of it after it becomes established and it continues to grow and add some nitrogen to your soils. But that landscape fabric on the beds is going to help keep it from creeping into your vegetable beds. You can also use landscape fabric. Depending on your climate, that can get really hot in the summertime. And so you want to be careful about raising the temperature too much in your vegetable beds because especially things like peppers, sometimes if they get too hot, they may drop their blossoms and you may get a lower yield. So you may be able to put the landscape fabric down for several weeks to suppress weeds, then pull it off as the summer, as it gets hotter in the summer and hoe between your rows. So just finding what works best for you. So we're going to take a little deep dive into our winter rye management and the study that we've been doing. And so winter rye and winter squash work really well together just due to the timing. It allows the time for the rye to grow to the desired stage because it's really important to let rye grow to a certain stage before you knock it down. And we transplant directly into that rye mulch, and Mark is going to go into more of that now.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the growth stages of rye, it's good to have a good sense of how this crop grows and develops so that you know when to get out there and crimp it or to mow it. This all assumes that you're going to be crimping or mowing. If you have like the silage tarp option or you're just going to lay landscape fabric over it, I guess you don't have to pay as much attention to the growth stages. But if you want them to die without having to put something over top of them afterward, definitely narrow in on the right growth stages for crimping or mowing. And so to back up a little bit, the ideal time to kill rye by crimping is my preferred choice is after it's kind of like it's done with flowering and seed development has started. I think you just have like a sure chance for success there. And so to know when that time is, it's good to have a sense of what they look like in different stages, which is what you see here. And so on the picture on the left is rye in the kind of like early to mid flowering stage. You can see those yellow anthers that dangle out from the seed head. And one thing to maybe not get confused is that when the seed head itself emerges from the stem early on in the spring, that's not when flowering begins. That's just like seed head emergence. But it only is going to be flowering when once you start to see those little anthers dangling out. This is for rye and for wheat and for barley and those kind of things. Oats is a little bit different if you're trying to do that because the anthers actually stay inside the little flower and you have to pull it apart. Nonetheless, go looking if you'd like. Then once rye is done with flowering, you can see in the middle there, it's kind of like at the end of its flowering cycle where those little yellow anthers are starting to turn brown. And then they just fall off, blow away in the wind, and seed development begins. And then once, if you want to get a kind of a sense of where seed development is, you can actually just like go in there, pull the plant apart, pull out a seed. It starts out itty bitty to where it's like even smaller than, way smaller than you see here in the picture where this is just like a developing kernel. But once it gets far enough along to where it's like the size of what you think of as a rye or a wheat kernel or whatever, if you were to go in there and squish it when it's young, this kind of like white milky substance comes out. And so we just call it the milky stage. It's still liquid inside. And as that matures, that liquid kind of dries down and it fills with starch and stuff. And so it ends up kind of more doughy when you squish it. And that's called the dough stage. And so the important thing to note here is it's just good to hit it after it's flowered, more or less, maybe at the end of flowering into early seed development. It doesn't even have to get to the milk stage. Before the milk stage, there's a photo not shown that's called water ripe. And if you squish the kernel where it's a really itty bitty kernel, just like a little tiny drop of water comes out. And so somewhere in their late flower, water ripe, maybe into the early milk stage is like your window where you have a good chance of success of getting that killed well without actually allowing the seed to mature once it's like, let's say it's crimped. And so here's an example of what crimping on the left to early looks like, and then crimping on the right, a little on the late side looks like. And so on the left, you get a lot of regrowth. So like you either get the stems will stand back up or they regrow from the base. It's just like incomplete kill. And it's just problematic. It's annoying to have to work with it because you might have to mow it. It continues to grow if you mow it. On the right side, which it was killed kind of like at the tail end of seed development where it's like transitioning from the milk stage to the dough stage, which gives you 100% kill. It's great, but you actually get seed development. And so that's what's not shown here in this picture is that like later in the season or maybe next year, that rye seed, which there's a ton of, because as you can imagine, there's like, it's a dense planting that creates a lot of seed. That sets seed. And so this year I had that problem by accidentally allowing my oats to go a little bit too late before killing them, and sweet potatoes. And thankfully there was landscape fabric between rows, but you could see these tidy rows of oats that were just, grown up and were definitely competing with the sweet potatoes for a while. And that was within the same season. So the idea here is just to strike a balance and go for that like end of flower, beginning of seed development stage. Now, if we're working in this kind of cover crop based no-till, and the important part is getting your cover crop killed so that you can transplant or plant your cash crop into it, it's a huge step because you've grown a ton of this biomass that you're going to like kill and turn into a mulch. And so you generally just need to have equipment or be prepared to do it. And there's a few ways to go about it that we're going to run through all of them and maybe talk about some of the trade-offs here. One of the more common pieces of equipment a lot of folks might have on their farm or in their kind of tool arsenal if they're working with a BCS is the ability to flail mow. And so flail mowers, if you haven't seen them, you can, there's a tractor drawn one on the left, there's the BCS version on the top and on the right. And the picture that's kind of on the bottom in the middle is what it looks like and on the underside of a flail mower. It's just these sort of V or Y-shaped blades that spin around really fast and chop up your cover crop. And so it's a great tool because you get this really reliable kill. You can probably get out there a little bit earlier to kill than when you're crimping. So you could like maybe cheat back on that growth stage a little bit. It creates this really nice, lovely mulch to plant into. It's really nice and uniform. And I think it's maybe a little bit easier to get through. But it decomposes really quickly. So you lose weed suppression over the course of the season because it's chopped up into fine bits that go away. However, maybe the trade-off there is that it probably provides a little bit more nutrition to the crop. So there's a trade-off there. And if you're working in a weedy field, then I just say forget the flail mower. But it's a great tool because it's versatile. You can use it for more than just killing cover crops, in contrast to the roller crimper. Excuse me. And then to switch over to the roller crimper, here's a few examples of that. Again, the success with which you kill the cover crop depends on its growth stage, and generally waiting later is better, but try not to hit seed development, or don't go too far into seed development. Again, the decomposition of that cover crop, your cover crop mulch, is slower. So you get better weed suppression over the course of the season, and maybe you get a little less nutrient supply from it. Although I think landscape fabric is this sort of intervention that makes that a little bit irrelevant for the crimper versus flail mowing thing. Maybe one thing to note about the roller crimper compared to flail mower is that it only does one thing on your farm. It just crimps and kills cover crops. And so it's this one tool dedicated to this one thing. It does really well, but it has the drawback of only doing one thing. So something to consider when moving forward with this. I think also it's worth mentioning that you can go really fast with the roller crimper. And when you're flail mowing that tall cover crop that's 6 to 8 feet tall, you're at high RPMs and low gear, going really slowly if you're trying to flail mow that. So the bottom left is a picture of the roller crimper that we used at Lomax for the study we're going to go into. The top middle and top right are a roller crimper that we built for the project that we're going to talk about that goes behind a walk-behind tractor, and it's very heavy. It's hard to manage. It's a lot to handle, and I wouldn't recommend trying to do a roller crimper on a walk-behind tractor that weighs 500 pounds. Like if you wanted to make it, I think you can make it work with less weight, and maybe with some other modifications involving landscape fabric. The bottom middle is a roller crimper that I think probably works better. That's made by Earth Tools. It works better because the blades, instead of being straight, as you see in the top middle, they're in a V-shaped pattern, much like the other commercial ones you see on the left. But they're relatively straightforward to make if you're inclined to do that kind of thing. And the picture on the bottom right is just crimped cover crop, and cover crop that has yet to be crimped at Red Scout Farm. And then finally, if you aren't working at a scale where you've got a tractor and a roller crimper, or maybe you don't even have or want to mess with a roller crimper for a walk-behind tractor, which I don't think is necessary, there's a really cheap, easy option that we just call the manual crimper. You operate kind of with your foot. And what it is just a piece of angle iron, which is a piece of steel that's bent at 90 degrees, basically. It's attached to a board. That board has a rope on it, and you hold it with the metal side facing down, and you just crimp with your feet. How well it works depends on the growth stage, like we've already talked about, but it also depends on the width of the crimper and how heavy you are. And so we don't really know exactly where the line is drawn to where it's not going to work by this method. But in the 2 years we've been doing this study, we've had complete success of killing the cover crop by waiting until the late flower, early seed development stage, even if we don't weigh nearly as much as the tractor version.
And if you're not going to do that much, then this is a really wonderful tool to have and a lot less expensive. And also taking into account the time it takes to set up the walk behind roller crimper. While the manual crimper does take longer to knock down the crop, you don't have the time of setting up a machine as well. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Okay, and so let's just pretend, if we were to back up for a second, that you've done a good job of killing your cover crop. It's crimped. Next step is to either transplant or direct seed into it, whichever you're doing, whichever crop. I think Mary Carroll prefers to always transplant. And I happen to be a direct seed kind of a person, but nonetheless, transplant, direct seed into it. The picture on the left is of crimped cover crop. The picture on the right is of mowed cover crop. Okay, so with all that kind of in mind, I want to do a sort of a quick rundown of the no-till experiment that we did as a CFSA joint partnered with Red Scout Farm. And so we implemented this at Lomax Farm, which is CFSA's farm near Charlotte area, and Red Scout Farm up here in the mountains. We did this for 2 seasons. the idea was to try to get a sense of, if you're a no-till grower, or if you're a farmer with a set amount of acreage and you want to go no-till, what kind of equipment works well, what kind of method works well, and is there like some acreage at which you should decide, okay, I've been doing this manually, I probably need to scale up to like the larger piece of equipment, whether that's like buying up to a walk behind tractor, or if you're already using that, maybe you want to buy up to a tractor. That was kind of the general idea, and also to just kind of compare crimped versus mowed systems. And then because we happen to like using landscape fabric and find it really useful, we threw that in as part of kind of the manual version of things. And of course, we wanted to compare that to the industry standard conventional till and bed with plastic. So we did that for 2 years. We did all the tractor stuff only at Lomax Farm, but everything else was done in full at Lomax and at Red Scout Farm. We followed that same kind of trajectory of planting rye in the fall, terminating it in the spring, planting which we use butternut squash, planting it into that crimped or mowed cover crop. So again, to rehash that, on the left, you see tractor treatments. We've got the crimpers on the bottom, flail mowing on the top. And the kind of, I guess, the middle left is the walk behind tractor treatments, crimping and mowing. And then in the middle right is our manual treatments, where we use that manual crimper. And then in the case of the landscape fabric, we crimped and then laid landscape fabric down on top of that. The first year we used a small width, just to throw a idea out there. We used the small width, basically the same crimper in the landscape fabric treatment as we did the regular manual crimping one. And in the second year, thought it might save time to just double that width, and we used a much wider one to save a little bit of time, which I think kind of will plays into the economy of scale that you can achieve maybe with this. And we'll get to the data presentation. And then far out to the right is the industry standard of tractor driven, tilled, and bedded with plastic. So just for a real quick overview, I know I've kind of said some of this, but we wanted to know how well you could kill a cover crop with a lighter roller crimper, whether that's the roller crimper for the walk behind tractor or the manual crimper itself. We wanted to get a sense of how weeds behaved in the situation. We are aware that weeds are going to be happier when mowed because of the reasons we already discussed. That cover crop is chopped up into little bits and they seem to make it through more quickly. But we also wanted to know how this affected yields, how much each treatment cost to implement on a per acre basis, and then maybe what the return is on that investment in dollars per acre earned. And that, I guess, goal number 2 is to try to identify these, what we're calling spatial and financial thresholds, which is really just like, at what acreage does it become more or less costly or profitable to do one thing over the other? Which, as you might imagine, is a pretty messy question to try to answer. And we'll get to some of that. So I'm going to run through some of the project results and try to do it quickly, although, of course, you'll have the option of pausing and coming back if you need to. So the way these graphs are generally set up are going to be the 3 tractor treatments on the left, the 2 walk-behind ones in the middle, and then the 2 manual ones on the right. And so that's crimped, mowed, tilled, and so on. This particular graph is the total cost of production for 1 acre of production. I say and emphasize that 1 acre thing because we'll get to in a few slides that the cost of production changes by acre for reasons that we'll get to in just a second. Now, the blue bars, which make up the bottom of each bar, are the cost of labor to implement each of these, valued at $12 to the hour. The orange bar in the middle is materials, fuel, maintenance, that kind of stuff. And then the gray bar that sits at the top of each bar is the cost of equipment. And so you can see in the tractor-based treatments, the cost of equipment is a lot higher than in the other ones. In the walk-behind ones, there is a cost of equipment. It's not as high. And in the manual ones, there's basically this like thin little sliver that you can barely see or not at all of the cost of equipment, which is just the cost of the crimper itself. Which is a manual crimper for like $5, right? The takeaway here is simply that on 1 acre, it costs more to do things with a tractor, which is pretty intuitive and will become relevant later. The other takeaway here is that it's pretty cheap to be able to do things manually. And as we'll see later, you can get pretty far doing these methods manually, particularly the landscape fabric one, just because you don't have to spend your time weeding. The third takeaway that I want to point out, if you look only at the blue bars and compare the mowing treatments to all the other ones, especially tilled and landscape fabric, you can see that there's more labor invested in those mowing ones. And that's because we spent more time weeding in those ones compared to tilling or landscape fabric. And I think it's useful to look at this in more detail. So we're actually going to take those blue bars, and on the next slide, we're going to blow it up into a few different categories of how we actually spent our time. So this is the management time for the same things, basically just like a labor breakdown where we spent our time based on 5 different categories. So the blue bars that are at the bottom in this graph are like cover crop management, bed management. So the time it took to kill your cover crop, to set up a row of irrigation tape or landscape fabric, or in the case of the tilling one, you're tilling, you're laying plastic, and then of course transplanting into all of that, which seeding and transplanting is the orange section of this one. The important point here is that the weeding and spraying, which is the majority of that bar, the gray one is actually just weeding. Spraying took up a very minimal amount of time compared to weeding time. And as you can see here, the gray bar for weeding and spraying is just a lot bigger in the mowing treatments than it is for anything else. And to my surprise, the tilled treatment had substantially more time spent weeding than the landscape fabric one. And I think the simplest answer there is just that there's more exposed soil in that situation. And you're actually disturbing the soil before you lay your fabric or your plastic down. So that's how that looks. I'm not going to say a whole lot more about it for the sake of time, and invite you to pause and take a look if you want to learn more about that. Or of course, we're going to be publishing this 2nd or 2-year summary results on the webpage soon. And just a quick little picture of what that looks like. Crimping is what you see on the left. In that left picture, you see crimping where there's like very few weeds, and then the plot just to the right of it was mowed, and you see a lot of crabgrass trying to make its way through there. And that's basically the same thing illustrated on the 2 pictures to the right of mowed versus crimped. Okay, for yield is obviously an important factor of this because we care how much income we're going to be able to generate based on the different treatments. I do want to say we did this for 2 years at Lomax and at Red Scout Farm. We had good success at Red Scout Farm because I think we had a small enough space to be able to manage with this, let's just say, the staff time we had. At Lomax Farm, we had the first year was extremely weedy and full of all kinds of pest pressure, and we basically just threw out the yield data because it wasn't good. Second year was challenging, but we got some yields, which gives us essentially unreplicated data from Lomax Farm. So I just want to emphasize, interpret any Lomax data relating to yields with caution. And Lomax, again, is on the left. Red Scout Farm is on the right in this situation. So the takeaway from here is that by a slim margin, using replicated data at Lomax Farm, the landscape fabric treatment came out on top. You can also see this happening at Lomax Farm, where it out-yielded all other treatments by a long shot in terms of total pounds per acre, pounds per plant, and just the number of plants that made it all the way to yield. And that last metric isn't shown here, but
and Mark, just to clarify, the manual landscape fabric, that is crimped cover crop with landscape fabric on top of it.
Yes, yeah. It is. Yep. And I don't want to say a whole lot more than the fact that landscape fabric seemed to do really well. The Lomax unreplicated data, I don't want to say much of anything else about because it's unreplicated. Maybe the final thing worth mentioning is that the walk behind treatments they yielded the same, and strangely, to our confusion, the manual crimped ones yielded significantly less. Although I do wonder if it has more to do with its location in the field, despite replication, than it does with a treatment effect. And so that's to be explored later. But for now, that's what we're kind of stuck with. Now, to calculate profitability, we're just taking total cost of production and yield into account with the squash valued at $1 per pound, which is a relatively low estimate for the value of that crop. And so I don't want to put much emphasis on the profitability data that we're showing here because of the lack of replication for Lomax, and they're essentially mirror the results from the yield graph that we saw just before. The one thing that maybe is worth noting is that again, if we focus just on the Red Scout data, the landscape fabric treatment, it cost less to implement and it yielded a little bit more. So as far as we can tell, it's probably going to be more profitable to do compared to the walk behind mowing or crimping or whichever, or of course to the manual crimped one, which seemed to be less profitable. Take all this with a grain of salt, particularly that manual crimped one, which may have to do with location in the field. And again, I don't want to say anything about profitability at Lomax because we just don't have yield data replicated. Okay, now before anyone's eyes cross looking at this, I want to just explain what we're doing here. So we wanted to know if it cost more or less per acre, per 2 acres, per half acre, whatever your scale of choice, to do a tractor-based roller crimper versus a walk-behind roller crimper, and so on and so forth for all the 7 treatments that we've already looked at here. And so just by doing some simple calculations, which is to say allowing, let me back up on how to explain that. Because if you own and operate a tractor and associated equipment to do roller crimping or mowing or tilling, it doesn't really matter if you're doing that on 1 acre or 10 acres. It costs about the same amount of money to own and operate that. And so as acreage increases, you achieve economies of scale so that the cost of running that equipment is spread across more acres, and therefore the per acre cost doesn't increase as much for those as it does for others. So they essentially start out very expensive, but as acreage increases, they don't increase as much as the other treatments. That was kind of the basis for trying to do this assessment. Now, a few things came out of it, which we put in red text, just 4 or 5 basic highlights here. Number one, and this is, I'm looking at the graph on the left, which is the total cost of production across acres for our 7 treatments. And it's worth maybe giving a quick explanation of the treatments. So in case it's a little bit easier to look at, the blue lines and dots are going to be mowing. The green lines and dots are going to be crimping. And the other 2, there's a sort of a yellow one for tilled and a sort of a peach colored one for the landscape fabric treatment. Tractor-based ones are diamond, the walk-behind ones are a circle, and the manually done ones are squares. If that's helpful to kind of know your way around on this couple of graphs. So if we just focus on the graph on the left, which is scaled all the way up to 10 acres, there's a little red circle toward the bottom that points out that landscape fabric is actually the cheapest to implement, cheaper than all other treatments, up to about 3.5 acres. So I take from that landscape fabric is a really good performer. It doesn't cost a lot to implement, and it ends up yielding pretty well, probably better than the other treatments, because you just have better weed suppression and probably better release of nutrients to feed your crop. The plants end up looking just overall much healthier. The next circle up is just to point out that tractor-based roller crimping and tilling become comparable right around 5 acres. And you can see that the gold line and that bottom green dashed line are the bottom 2 lines going up as you look up and to the right on that graph. And so that's just to say that they are the cheapest to implement per acre above 5 acres. So if you're working above 5 acres, definitely consider using a tractor. Of course, I think that's assumed. And the roller crimper is pretty cost competitive with tilling, just to throw that out there. If you look at the graph on the right, that's a zoom in to 2.5 acres. So you're basically just kind of scrunching that down so we can get a better look at what's going on down there at the sub 2.5 acre level, because that's where all the action is. If you were to look very closely, and maybe you need to look back at the key a few times, you can see that if you look all the way back down at it's 0.1 acres. If you were to look up and down at 0.1 acres, you can see that the most expensive things to do are tractor-based tractor-based methods. If you drop down to the next two, that cluster of two, that's walk-behind tractor, and then the one at the bottom is the two manual treatments. And so that is to say that at low acreages, they're the most costly to implement. And as soon as you start working your way up in acreage, those lines kind of cut across all the other lines to become cheaper and cheaper. And so that's where you see that happening, for example, in the graph on the left, where the tilling and tractor crimping end up the cheapest. They're cutting all the way across all those other lines. And likewise, or in a similar way, if we look back at the graph on the right, the two mowing treatments do the same thing, but only to become more expensive. They kind of shoot up just way quicker than the other ones in terms of acreage to become more expensive. Basically, the most expensive around 1 acre or less, regardless of whether you're using a tractor or a walk behind and so forth.
And that's mainly because of the weeding.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. So it is that way simply because you spend more time weeding. Mm-hmm. It's just more costly to implement that that treatment. I find this this result to be a little surprising, but you only have to get up to 1.5 acres before it becomes more cost effective to use a tractor-based roller crimper than the one on the walk behind. Just 1.5 acres, basically. Now, it's important to point out here that it's still cheaper to do the manual method of crimping up to 1.5 acres and beyond. As you can see, that bottom dashed line that's green is still the bottom dashed line and hasn't been overtaken by the other equipment types. So just goes to say that these manual methods can actually go a pretty far away in the field and still be the cheaper ones to implement. And then that final sort of circle and red text up on the top right is just to point out that tillage quickly becomes cheaper as you go up in acreage and becomes the second cheapest thing overall once you're above 5 acres. So that's all I'll say about costs. I know it's a lot to take in because this is a ton of data kind of condensed into one thing, but those are the takeaways that I think are most important. Now, that was just the cost data. If you were to take into account what can be potentially earned in relation to that cost, you get profitability, of course. Because with that Lomax data was unreplicated, I didn't feel it was worth to try to put in here for profitability analysis. And just want to throw out there that you can work with this data to calculate profitability very simply. And there's a couple of key takeaways. Basically, everything that we did at Red Scout Farm was profitable down to even the 0.1 acres. So we recouped the cost of equipment at a very small size. So that to me is a beneficial thing. It's worth pointing out, and you can see this in kind of like that pink or red box in the bottom right graph, that it's pretty easy if you don't have good yields, if you're working with expensive equipment and you're in a weedy year and you're stuck with hand weeding, it's pretty easy for tractor-based implementation of these things to be put you at a net loss if you are farming at such a small acreage like that 0.1 to 0.25. And granted, the tractor data are not shown here, and that was on purpose just because I didn't want to show Lomax data because it involved unreplicated yield data. But suffice it to say, a lot of those treatments came out negative because yields were low at Lomax. Weed pressure was relatively high, and it's expensive to implement tractor-based stuff, especially at low acreages. Okay, finally, manual crimping became the least profitable at 0.18 acres. And so I point that out just to say that because it yielded less, if you recall, we had that lower yield value for manual crimping, it ends up being less profitable than the other ones, despite taking a little bit less time to deal with. And it's worth pointing out that, again, landscape fabric performs the best here, which is that top sort of brownish line and square. That is always the most profitable, and it continues to be the most profitable as it scales up. So just another way to look at the same data. One thing,
secret sauce.
Yeah, it is in this case where we maybe lack access to good compost, where we could use that instead, so on and so forth. Up here in the mountains, it seems to be something that works really well up here. One thing I haven't mentioned that's on this graph that you might be wondering what in the heck is going on. This is just sort of as an aside. We wanted to know if you were farming full time, 40 hours a week. Let's just put some constraints on it. 40 hours a week for the 5-month season of growing winter squash. It adds up to about 850 hours. And if you translate the amount of time you work according to the acreage that you can accomplish by these different methods, you end up with different maximum acreages. And suffice it to say, based on the labor inputs alone, landscape fabric allows you to accomplish or achieve more acreage if this assumes you're like one person working full time, only at 40 hours, and so forth. And the most labor intensive ones put you at the least farmable acreage within that sort of full time scenario. So the landscape fabric, if you were just one person, 40 hours a week, you can maybe achieve 3.5 acres. If you decided you wanted to do it mowing and you had to spend more time weeding, then you can probably only do somewhere between 2 to 2.5 acres, according to this analysis. So that's those red hash marks shown on the graph with the red text next to it about maximum farmable acreage. So just as a side note, just so you know. Okay, so for some really quick takeaways of our no-till experiment, just to rehash, landscape fabric was worth the cost and the time to apply. We had higher yields, saved time in weeding. It was the least expensive thing to do, up to 3.5 acres, and you could probably farm more of it, leading to like essentially just higher profits.
You can also use that landscape fabric year after year. So you can make that initial investment, and as long as you take good care of it, it should last for multiple years.
Yeah. We have some farmers up here in the mountains that say they've been using theirs for about 2 decades, I think, which is a lot. I've had mine for 6 years, and it's fine. So
depends on the quality too.
Yes. Take good care of it, and it should last a good while. So other takeaways: above 3.5 acres, you're going to be in tractor land, tractor-based roller crimper. But assuming that you're not working at that high of an acreage, maybe going with the manual methods is the most cost-effective way to get there. Or maybe there's some other combination of walk behind and lighter equipment that we can arrive at, but we don't have yet. If you like mowing and you don't want to mess with crimping, or like you have a flail mower and you want to put it to use and you don't want to buy a roller crimper, just cover it. Cover whatever you mow with a persistent mulch, whether that's landscape fabric or heavy straw or whatever it is. So if mowing is your tool, just follow it with a mulch. Keep that in mind. Let's see here. So because there's essentially, you're limited to hand weeding, even in the tractor and walk behind tractor treatments, or like if those are your tools of choice, because you're limited to that, it essentially negates efficiencies achieved with using that equipment, which is a bummer for you trying to become more efficient. And so I think on the next slide, there's a little bullet advocating for some mechanization of some no-till weeding stuff, particularly for small scale, because it already exists for tractors. One of the bottom bullet on here about manual crimping, just feel like it's worth pointing out or reiterating. We were able to achieve similar cover crop kill at that late flower, early seed development growth stage using a manual crimper, using a walk behind crimper that's lighter than that for a tractor, on like a pounds per foot of down pressure, which we found to be great, which means that you don't have to have a huge heavy roller crimper if you wait that long, late flower, early seed development. Okay, ignore the picture out to the right. That is the high residue cultivator. We'll get to that in a second. I just want to point out that the tilling treatments performed well. They were about the cheapest to implement at high acreages. They were actually right behind the tractor roller crimper, but regardless, about the cheapest. They had really good weed control season long because obviously it's under plastic. I would expect that it's the more consistent one over time, especially when you have like weedy conditions, or you have a weedy year, or you're in a weedy field. I would expect it to perform better than the roller crimped ones regardless, just because you get that season long weed suppression. And I take away from that we shouldn't then just rely on tillage, but it's sort of pointing out where we have progress to be made in no-till. And so I think that no-till can be improved, particularly if we're going in the small scale direction, by mechanizing weed control. And so Whether or not this is achievable, I don't know yet, but a high residue cultivator, if you're not familiar with it, there's a picture of that out to the right, and it simply keeps your cover crop mulch intact while running a broad sweep below the soil between your crop row. And it's a pretty amazing tool for what it does. Obviously, I'm not advocating that small scale growers buy a big tractor and a big piece of equipment like you see in the picture. That's just an example. But I think it might be achievable, and especially in a weedy year would be a better use of your time. Let's see here. I think that also a lighter and more manageable roller crimper for or one that can be manually operated, like something that could be pushed or pulled just you, would make a big difference if you were to compare that to the manual crimping treatments, just because it's really slow going to just take a step to crimp this stuff down. And if you could put something like that onto a walk behind that you can actually handle, I think it would go a really long way in improving the efficiency of either of those methods. In a similar vein, I also think that landscape fabric, which is currently applied manually, if we could figure out a way, just get our ag engineer friends together, fabricate some equipment, maybe develop something that could apply landscape fabric and maybe remove it too, in a way that's efficient. I feel like it could probably cut your landscape fabric management time down by like a lot, probably a small fraction of what you normally would spend on it, and then just improve efficiency, a huge deal. There are other options that we haven't talked about that are mulch related and no-till. For example, growing a high residue cover crop parallel to the crop that you're growing, and then at some point you cut it down and you throw it on top right next door. It's called the grow zone mow zone method, I guess. Little things like that could be used to improve it if you are averse to using landscape fabric, for example. And just a final caveat, there's a lot of other no-till methods out there. And there's many mulches, many ways to do it. And this study was only kind of like narrowing in on a few of them. So I don't want to imply that these are the only ways to do it. But parting thoughts on the no-till project. Okay. So you want to go ahead?
Sure. So there are definitely challenges with no-till. So as we talked about before, the weeds, while you're not bringing as many weed seeds to the surface, those weeds can be difficult to manage, particularly the perennial weeds. So you do need a good weed management plan. Also, that mulch, it can create a great habitat for pests, from slugs to squash bugs and cucumber beetles. And so if one thing that we found helpful this year is we covered all of our beds with insect row cover, our butternut squash beds with insect row cover until they began flowering. And that helped at least the insects that were new insects that were coming in from other parts of the field, helped to at least exclude them for a while. But at the same time, it can also provide a habitat for those beneficial insects. When using the cover crop mulches, sometimes you have some nitrogen limitation as that cover crop is breaking down, especially plants that have a high nitrogen demand. So as you put that landscape fabric on top, or if you use a tarp to put that on top, that can help the plants break down and release the nitrogen more quickly. And we farm on the side of a hill. So this roller crimper was a lot to handle. You can see both Griffin and Mark working to move it here in this picture. And so that's where I find personally that I like the manual crimper for our small acreage.
Light and fast.
Yes.
Yeah.
So takeaways, we've got to remember that this takes time, and cover crops are so important to feed the soil, prevent erosion, decrease weeds, and improve our soil structure. We just want to create an environment for all of that microbial life to be happy and healthy so that it can feed our plants. And I feel like, at least for us, the number one thing we want to do, even above growing crops, is to improve our soil, because we know that the more that we do that, the more that the soil is going to help us out by producing healthy, strong plants. So also just remember that timing is key, especially if you're using these cover crop mulches like rye. You really need to know the life cycle. And so go back and review those slides that Mark talked about to know exactly when to terminate your cover crop. Landscape fabrics, silage tarp, really wonderful ways to help break down the cover crops and suppress weeds, and also force some of those weed seeds to germinate. And also, as we're trying to use less plastic, using those silage tarps and landscape fabric that we can take care of year after year can help reduce that single-use plastic in the field. And also, I would just encourage you, at least if you're on my scale, start out with that manual crimper. For $5, you can put that together, and it is very effective. It takes a little bit longer, but if you're just doing a small number of rows, it can be very, very effective. So no-till is a lot more, helps you to be a lot more resilient. And as we are dealing with all these effects of climate change, we really want to think about how to make our crops and our farms more resilient. And we have found that no-till has helped us a lot with that, because our soil isn't washing away, even when we have 3 major flooding events as we've had this year in the mountains. So we've had much less erosion, even though we're farming on a hill. And also in droughts, we've had no rain now for 15 days. I mean, we've had multiple periods of that through this growing season. That cover crop mulch helps to hold the water down in the soil. And also all these other no-till methods, because there's air in the soil, and because we have all these spaces where the plant roots are and where plant roots have decayed, there are all these little channels for water to infiltrate down in the soil and to stay there at the root zone where our plants need them. So just remember, it's important to really stick with this for several years. This isn't the way that we started out on our farm. Our field was fallow for 17 years, and we just had a huge weed problem. And we just continued to harrow and harrow and harrow, but we continued to pull up more and more weed seeds, we realized. And so we have found in the last few years, transitioning to no-till has really helped our soil. Soil is amazing, y'all. And if you can continue to really focus on growing that soil and improving the soil, not growing the soil, but improving the soil by growing cover crops, by leaving the roots in place, and just providing this healthy ecosystem, I think you'll find that your soil health improves. So again, just consider the long-term health of the soil and be patient. It will come. So thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time to be with us today, and we hope that you'll join us for the live question and answer.
Yep. Thanks a lot, y'all. See you soon.
Thanks.